Chapter 37. Jenni had just started to return to the beach house when the door leading to the kitchen opened. Wearing a long black dress that reminded her of a morning gown, Curioso descended the wooden steps. She seemed oblivious to Jenni's presence as she looked out at the reflected sky. After a few moments, however, she turned to face towards the nurse. She smiled slightly and gave a small wave. "Hello, Miss Grant," the woman said pleasantly. Jenni didn't immediately answer. It had been so long since she had spoken to someone other than herself that the concept was nearly foreign to her. "It's been a while," she said finally. "Nice dress." "Sorry, what?" Curioso replied with mild confusion. "The dress that you're wearing." "Oh, I'm wearing a dress," the woman said with a shrug. "I hadn't noticed. Things are changing, as you can see from this gorgeous view. You look absolutely exhausted." Jenni didn't reply. She wasn't surprised that she looked tired. For nearly a year she had been running on a lack of sleep, jumping at every sound she heard every single night. The exhaustion had become part of her daily life. "It's been wonderful catching up," Curioso said with a hint of sarcasm in her voice. "But I'm afraid that I'm not here for you. Come along, people." She stepped out of the way, and a line of people began streaming out from inside the house and down the stairs. When each one reached the sand, they turned and walked to the edge of the water before standing still. They did all of this in silence, their faces blank and eyes unfocused. Jenni felt a chill run down her spine. She knew these people, or at least a good portion of them. Carol Dilfer, the mayor of Lamplight Woods, passed by her without acknowledgement. Soon after, Wally Carver appeared at the top of the steps, having to turn sideways to get through the door. Ralph Parsons, Terry Fields, Harold Madison. These people were the residents of Lamplight Woods. "Aren't reunions wonderful?" Curioso asked with a smile. "What did you do to them?" Jenni demanded. "And how did you do it to the entire town?" "Me? I didn't do anything. I'm merely the Grand Marshal of this parade. It's not the entire town, either, just the people that stayed at the carnival after the kiddies were sent home." The entranced people were lining up along the edge of the water. Soon the line stretched up and down the beach. They stared off towards the horizon, where the night sky and the reflecting water seemed to meet. "What are they doing?" Jenni asked. "What they were born to do," Curioso replied. "You might say that they were destined to be right here at this very moment. They will receive a great honor before gladly making the ultimate sacrifice." "The ultimate... You mean that they're... Well, I must be going," Curioso interrupted her, going up the stairs to the kitchen. "This has been a fascinating chat. It really has. But no rest for the wicked and all that." Jenni quickly moved to follow. She hadn't taken more than a few steps before Curioso spun around and pointed a finger at her. Her entire body seized up, and she fell to the ground without being able to move a muscle. "None of that," Curioso said as she walked out of sight. The hold on Jenni's body released, and she laid gasping in the sand. Her body had frozen so completely that she hadn't even been able to draw air into her lungs. It was the most helpless she had ever felt, and even though it had only lasted a few seconds, it was enough to shake her. She slowly got to her feet and brushed the sand out of her hair with her hand. She took a few deep breaths to slow her racing pulse. Curioso had said that things were changing, and there was certainly enough proof to show that she was telling the truth. She needed to stay calm and be ready for anything. She went down to the edge of the water to the line of Lamplight Woods residents. The closest person to her was Mayor Dilfer. Maggie had a very contentious relationship with the woman, and because of that, Jenni wasn't much of a fan of her either. It was strange to see her dressed in casual clothing, rather than her usual severe business suits. The mayor didn't seem to register that Jenni was there. Her face remained expressionless, and her eyes were so blank that they could have easily passed for glass doll eyes. It was like there wasn't a person in there at all. Mayor? Jenni said as she gently shook the woman. Mayor Dilfer, can you hear me? There was no response, and there was no change in her demeanor. Jenni tried the same thing with a few other people, but each time there was the same response. Eventually she gave up and returned to the house. She watched the people through the kitchen windows for a while. None of them moved or had even the slightest reaction to anything. It was incredibly creepy, and Curioso's statement that they would make the ultimate sacrifice replayed over and over in her mind. The vibration that she had felt earlier was still present. In fact, it seemed to have gained in intensity. She could feel it through the kitchen floor. Her eyes fell on the crude wooden spear that she had discarded. She was tempted to go reclaim it, if for no other reason than having any kind of weapon would make her feel better. She knew that there was no point in doing so, though. Whatever was going on was too big for a glorified tree branch to make a difference. Still, it wouldn't hurt to have something to defend herself with. There wasn't much to work with in the house. She had been through every inch of it and the supplies that had been left for her, but she hadn't found anything that could be used as a weapon. Even the fork and knife that had been provided were soft plastic. Something clicked in her mind. Walking quickly into the living room, she opened the case that contained the fishing equipment. Because of her discomfort with the ocean, she had never used any of it, and the small hooks that had been provided wouldn't have made for a very useful weapon anyway. She wasn't interested in the hooks, however. She pulled out the fishing rod and examined it closely. It was a cheap fiberglass rod, the kind that could be bought at any store. Standing up, she placed it on the ground and repeatedly stomped and pulled on it until she was able to break off a section about 6 inches in length. She picked it up and examined it closely. It had broken at an angle, and the point was extremely sharp. Grabbing the fishing line, she repeatedly wrapped it around the bottom half of the piece to form a makeshift handle. When she had finished, she hefted it a few times before nodding to herself. She carefully slid it into her pocket and made sure that she could easily retrieve it. The homemade shiv would probably only be strong enough for one use, but hopefully she wouldn't have to use it at all. Chapter 38. Maggie noticed that Michael seemed a bit off as they crossed the bridge and headed towards the carnival. He was still making sure to watch out for any potential dangers, but he had a strange expression on his face as he did so. Granted, they were in an extremely dangerous situation and walking into God only knew what. She didn't think that was what was running through his mind, however. "You okay?" she asked. "Hmm?" Michael replied, apparently surprised by her speaking. "Oh, yeah, I'm fine." "You sure? The last thing we need is for you to have your head somewhere else right now." "I'm okay," he assured her. "It's just that I've never killed anyone before. Demons and whatever are one thing, but this... I get it." He shook his head as if to clear it. "Anyway, I can deal with that after this is all over. Let's take care of business." "Right." She glanced over at him. "Before we get there, you should probably tell me what else you brought from home. That death plan of yours shocked the hell out of me, and I don't want that to happen again." "Good point." He pointed at the jacket he was wearing. "This is a coat that was once owned and worn by Aleister Crowley, a famous occultist and warlock. It's the coat that he was found dead in, actually." "It just looks like some old jacket," she observed. "It was imbued with a small portion of his power when he died. I'll be able to use it to cast a few spells with the energy that's left." Spells. We're talking about magic here? Damn it, I hate magic. He smiled slightly and nodded. "I'm not too big of a fan of it either, not after Morgan Clay used it to release those demons. Anyway, I don't know how much I'll be able to get out of it, as there isn't much power left. I'm going to try to keep it to simple spells and enchantments to get the most mileage from it." Maggie sighed. I remember when the most complicated part of my life was my weekly arrest of Sammy Hines for running around naked and drunk. What else do you have? Just this. Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black stone. A piece of draconite. It's a magical stone taken from the head of a dragon. It can create a large burst of flame, but it's only good for one use. I have to tell you, I'm a bit underwhelmed. A coat that can do a couple of things before it's just a coat again, and a rock that blows up. The way you were talking, I thought that you had some things that would do some major damage. Everything else was either irrelevant, unreliable, or just too dangerous. There isn't much use stopping Bingo if we wipe Lamplight Woods off the map in the process. This will have to be enough. They reached the front gate of the carnival. The ticket booth wasn't manned, and there wasn't anyone in sight. Maggie's eyes narrowed. "Do you hear anything?" she asked. "No," Michael replied after listening for a moment. "That's really strange." "Yeah, half the town was here. That many people should be making some noise." They stopped just outside the gates as they both saw the same thing at the same time. Floating in the middle of one of the roller coaster loops, its pupil staring straight down at something out of sight, was a giant eye. "Are we just going to ignore that?" Maggie asked, her voice tight. "Yes," Michael confirmed. "Yes, we are." "Okay, good. Just checking." They went through the front gate and continued past the food vendor stalls. Like the ticket booth, these were empty. Things such as hot dog warmers and snow cone machines were still running, however, making it seem like everyone had simply vanished. It felt like a trap, but they made it to the forked path that marked the beginning of the exhibits without incident. Maggie led them down the left path as she figured that one way was just as good as the other. They quickly checked each tent as they went by. All of them were empty. They showed the same signs of a quick evacuation as the food stalls had. "What's in here?" Michael asked quietly, pointing to the large tent in the center. "It's for stage shows," she replied in the same hushed tones. They came to the tent entrance and, after a quick look back the way they had come, hurried inside. It was completely different inside than it had been when Maggie had done her inspection with the woman she had known as Curioso. The stage was still there, but the chairs had been removed. A tall cage had been set up in one corner. It was empty, and its door was open. There was something on the stage. She moved closer and found that it was a heap of some green flesh-like material and black sludge. It gave off a hideous smell, and she quickly covered her nose with her forearm. Michael had gone over to the cage to examine it. As she turned away from the disgusting pile, she saw him running his fingers over the bars. He seemed concerned by it, and after taking a closer look at the bottom of the cage, that concerned look only deepened. "What is it?" she asked. "This cage is pure iron," he replied slowly. "There are chunks of discolored skin and bone on the floor." "Discolored like this shit on the stage?" He shook his head. "More like it's old and decayed. Maggie, I think they were keeping skin rot in here." In the first case that they had worked together after Michael and his daughter had moved to Lamplight Woods, they had investigated a case involving demons that had been summoned and taken the forms of local horror legends. One of those legends was skin rot, a rotting zombie-like creature that supposedly lived in the local cemetery. They had killed 2 of the 4 demons, but the one that had taken the form of skin rot had escaped. Something on the ground caught her eye. She pushed aside some of the rotted skin with the tip of her boot and found a piece of fabric. It was covered in black fur. "Oh," Michael said as he saw what she had discovered. "Oh no." "What?" she demanded as she watched the blood drain out of his face. "What is it?" I think that both skin rot and the bingo puppet died here." "And that's bad?" "That is very bad." He looked over at the biological material on the stage. Bingo didn't choose to be a puppet. He was forced into that form when something went wrong with a ritual Poe was performing in an attempt to make him immortal. His body was destroyed, and the only thing that she had to tie his soul to before it was too late was the puppet. Maggie looked him in the eye. What does this have to do with the here and now? Bingo has been trying to get a new body for decades. The problem for him has been that every human body he's tried has burned away from the inside out, just like his original one did. I'm really not... Skin rot wasn't human, Maggie. At least not after it fully took over the child host. It was a demon. Fuck! I've been thinking that this was about some personal vendetta towards my family, when this whole time, it's been about freeing himself from that damn puppet. Just as sharp as ever, Mikey, an amused voice said from the tent entrance. Chapter 39. The person standing in the entrance to the tent was Bingo. Michael was sure of it even though he had only ever seen the man while he was trapped inside of the now destroyed hand puppet. The voice was the same though, and there was something about how the person was watching him that gave him the same feelings of revulsion and fear. The man was a bit taller than Michael, with a bald head and a clean-shaven face. He was dressed in a black Hawaiian shirt, a pair of khakis, and brown shoes. He watched them with an expression of disinterest. "I know, right?" Bingo said. "Quite the change from the rambunctious little scamp I was oh so long ago. My, how the minutes just fly by." "Skin rot," Michael began. "Yup, skin rot. It took some doing, but Poe was able to scoop out his mind to replace it with my own. She also got rid of that pesky rotting skin and made me look like my old self. Oh, but don't worry, Mikey. I'm still in here." Bingo smiled, and Michael took an involuntary step back. His face completely changed. The grin stretched from ear to ear, and there were no lips or skin along it. Blood-red gums and impossibly white, wolf-like fangs were revealed. His eyelids retracted into his head, and his manic eyes twitched in their sockets. The smile faded, and his face returned to that of a normal person. "I'm learning a lot about myself today," Bingo said. "Turns out that I don't just go back to being my handsome old self when I get put into a demon's body. I become something more. A lot more power in this shell than I ever had as a man or a puppet." "Okay, fine, you got your new body or whatever," Maggie said, her gun in her hand even though she had to know that it wouldn't do any good. "You got what you wanted. You won. Let my wife go." Bingo raised an eyebrow. "And what reason would I possibly have to do that? Besides, the night is just getting started. Lots to do and little time to do it. Keeping your dear sweet Jenni ensures that you two behave yourselves until I can take my time with you later." He threw back his head and laughed, and his nightmare face returned as he did so. Michael forced himself to look closely at it. The creature had taken on a new form, and every bit of data that he could collect about it was important. "Oh, we're going to have so much fun later tonight," Bingo proclaimed as he stopped laughing, his face reverting. "I wish that we could get the ball rolling now, but unfortunately, I have a previous engagement." He turned to leave. Knowing that he needed more information about what was happening, and that this might be his only chance to get it, Michael held out his hand. "Wait," he said quickly. "Just wait. Sheriff Grant's right. You're obviously in control here." "So glad to see that you recognize that," Bingo said with amusement in his voice. "I just don't understand what all this is about. Why are you doing this?" Bingo stared at him for a long moment. There was an expression on his face that Michael didn't recognize. He finally shook his head slightly. "Come on, Mikey," he said. "Do you really think that I'm just going to exposition dump my plan like a villain in a Bond movie? I'll tell you what, though. One little hint, for old time's sake." He reached into his pocket and took something out of it. He held it up so that Michael could see what it was. It was the key attached to the green diamond-shaped keychain that Poe had taken from Forgotten Tales. He put the key back into his pocket. "That's all you get," Bingo told him. "Now I really must be off. People to see, bargains to break." With a little wave, he turned and left the tent. Michael hurried over to the exit and looked out, but Bingo had already disappeared in the few seconds it took him to get there. He swore violently. "Did you ever find out what that key goes to?" Maggie asked as she lowered the peacemaker. "No," Michael replied angrily. "There was a sort of hotel for the rich here in Lamplight Woods called the Blackwood Lodge, which is the same name as on the keychain, but it burned down in the late 1940s. There's nothing left of it. I checked." "What do we do now?" Taking a deep breath, he brought his temper back under control. It was difficult to do so. Once again, he was 2 steps behind Bingo and struggling to catch up. He closed his eyes. If he could just force himself to see past the anger and fear so that he could think straight, he might be able to close the gap a bit. He opened his eyes as something came to him. "What did Bingo say about a bargain?" he asked. "He said that he's going to break a bargain, right?" Yeah, I think he did," Maggie replied after a second's thought. "Is that important?" "Maybe. I think he told us more than he meant to. Do me a favor and keep watch for a minute. I have to piece this together." She replaced him at the tent flap, and he started to slowly walk around the inside of the tent. For years, even after he had left Lamplight Woods with Sarah to move to the West Coast, Michael had been obsessed with learning everything that he could about Bingo. Some of it was because he wanted to make sure that he protected his daughter, but if he was honest with himself, a lot of it was because he was obsessed with figuring out what had gone wrong and led to Evelyn's death. He had gathered every scrap of information that he could through every legal channel, and a few that weren't quite so legal. There hadn't been much. From what he could tell, the man behind Bingo, Walter Douglas, had started as a legitimate children's performer. His television show, Bingo Circus Extravaganza, had aired on various local stations throughout the 70s and 80s. At first it had just been him performing with puppets, but over time he had added other performers such as Bango, Leo, and Poe. Somewhere along the way, though, something changed. Strange disappearances and murders began to happen in the towns that the show was airing in and live performances were taking place in. At first they were scattered, but as the show went on, they became more and more common. There was never anything to directly link them to the show's performers, though, so no connection was ever made. Even after the show stopped airing, people reported seeing it randomly appear on their televisions. As far as he could tell, the show would come on at various times for no apparent reason on screens in a small town, and soon after, there would be multiple killings. This would continue for a few weeks before both the viewings and killings would stop. That was what had happened in Lamplight Woods soon after Sarah had been born. Michael remembered the first time he had seen one of the broadcasts. The football game he and Evelyn had been watching had suddenly burst into static, and when that static faded, they were looking at the title screen for a children's show called Bingo Circus Extravaganza. When he had tried to change the channel, the show had stayed on, and the television continued to show it even after he had tried turning it off and unplugging it. The killings had begun shortly after, all of them extremely violent, and none of them with witnesses. There had been one exception to that, when he had walked in on Bingo repeatedly stabbing Evelyn to death. He shook his head firmly in an effort to clear that image from it. Now wasn't the time for that. He needed to focus. One of the documents that Michael had obtained through less than legal means had been a medical report for Walter Douglas. A few years into the initial run of the show, he had been diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. It was just weeks later that the first killing he managed to link with Bingo Circus Extravaganza occurred. He had always believed that the two events were related. He also believed that the piece of the puzzle that connected them was Poe. There were numerous stories, all of them from personal accounts and none from official records, that contained mentions of Poe having what could only be described as magical powers. Witchcraft was a term that got thrown around too often with regards to these types of powers, but in this case, it seemed fitting. From what he had seen tonight with Bingo now inhabiting a new demonic body, he was able to put a few other pieces together. Poe must have helped him escape his cancer by putting a soul into the hand puppet he had been inside until very recently. It would explain how he had avoided the death sentence his doctor had given him. Why, though? Why put him into a puppet instead of a human body? The only answer that he could come up with was that Poe couldn't do that for some reason. Maybe a human body couldn't survive whatever the process was, or maybe there was some other reason. Whatever the case, it was safe to say that it simply wasn't a possibility. A demon's body was quite a bit sturdier than a human one, though. It could take a lot more of a beating. That would make it a more viable host. He frowned. No witch that he'd ever heard of had the kind of power required to unlatch a soul from a body and latch it onto another. She would have needed help beyond what a person was capable of giving her. It would have meant acquiring power from something else, something more. Poe would have had to make a bargain with something with almost godlike power. A bargain to break, he muttered. What was that? Maggie asked from the tent entrance. I think I know what's happening, Michael told her. I think that for Poe to gain the powers that she has, she had to make a deal with something very strong and something very ancient. Something that for all intents and purposes is a god. Now that she and Bingo have what they want, though, they don't want to keep paying whatever the price of that deal was. They're going to try to break their bargain. Can they do that? Maggie, I don't even know the details of it, let alone what they made the deal with, or if I'm even right. Bingo seems confident, though, and I've learned the hard way to never underestimate him. Chapter 40. In an attempt to avoid going through the tents that had popped up all over town, Sarah and Josh had decided to go through the woods to wrap around to the back of the field the carnival was located in. It had been slow going, especially since they hadn't been able to use their bikes, but they had finally arrived at their destination. As she dropped her currently useless bike and concealed it in some brush, she looked up at the roller coaster and shivered. The giant eye was still there, although it was currently turned inward towards the center of the carnival. We should stay outside as long as possible, Josh said. Sarah jumped slightly at the sound of his voice. They hadn't said a word to each other the entire time that they had been walking. They had both been lost in their own thoughts. I was thinking the same thing, she agreed. I don't suppose that you have any idea how we can find my dad and Sheriff Grant. No clue. Do you see something wrong with this, though? You mean besides the obvious giant eyeball, I take it? Yes. There's nobody else around. Maybe the roller coaster and buildings are just making it seem like that, but I don't hear any crowd noise either. It's pretty late, she pointed out. Maybe the majority of people have gone home? He stared at her. Yeah, okay, wishful thinking, she admitted. I'm thinking that we should circle around to the Sea Lodge and see if we can find Jenni. Hopefully we can be in and out before anyone sees us. Right. They slowly moved around the outside of the carnival, staying concealed in the brush as long as they could. Eventually they were forced to move out into the open, however. They stayed as low as possible as they walked, but Sarah still felt extremely exposed. All it would take would be a single person with a flashlight to reveal them. Josh led the way to the Sea Lodge. There was something in both the way he was moving and the tone in his voice when he had spoken that had made her wonder if they should have stayed back at the safe house. He seemed both determined and scared at the same time. His experiences inside the lodge had changed him. They didn't really have much of a choice, though. Only Josh knew exactly what was happening in the lodge, and if he was right and Jenni was being kept there, They had to let her father and the sheriff know. There was also the possibility that they might be able to free her themselves. Somehow, they managed to make it to the lodge without incident. There was no back door, so they went around the right side of the building. The windows had been boarded up, making it impossible to see inside. They reached the front porch and took a quick look around. When they didn't see anyone, they went up onto the porch and to the front door. Sarah glanced up at the giant eye. It was looking off in the opposite direction. She wasn't sure what would happen if it spotted them, but she knew it wouldn't be good. Josh had walked directly to the door. He took a deep breath and turned the knob. It was unlocked, and it swung inward. "What the fuck?" he exclaimed. There was nothing inside. It was just one large empty room covered in dust. Josh stared at it in disbelief. He shook his head. "It was right fucking there," he said. "I don't understand." He turned to her, a worried expression on his face. "You have to believe me, Sarah," he pleaded. "I'm not going crazy here. I went through this door, and I was suddenly in an old house at a beach." "Hey, I believe you," Sarah reassured him. "Of course I do. Something must have been different when you went through last time." He closed his eyes and thought for a moment before opening them again. "Curioso, or I guess Poe, brought me here. She used a key to unlock it." "That key must be the difference. It makes sense. They wouldn't want just anyone being able to go to the beach house, right? You must have to use the key to get in." "Which means that we need Poe's key to open the door to where we want to go." Sarah nervously checked the eye before saying, "I have no idea how to get it away from her. I hope you do." "I have absolutely zero ideas about that, Sarah. We'll just have to... Wait, what's that?" He was looking in the direction of the roller coaster, and she felt a cold chill as she turned back towards it. She thought that the eye had spotted them, but it was still staring off in a different direction. Following the direction of his eyes, she found that he wasn't actually looking at Ex Oblivion. Instead, he was focusing on the Ferris wheel. There were numerous dark shapes moving on the struts and cars of the structure. It was hard to tell from such a distance, but they looked like incredibly thin people wearing all black clothing. She took out her phone and tapped on the camera app. Using the zoom option, she got in as close to one of the shapes as she could. The figure wasn't wearing black clothing. Its entire body, with the exception of its bone-white face, was the color of the night sky. The resolution of the screen was poor when it was this zoomed in, but she could still make out the sharp teeth in the creature's mouth. "Strigoi," she said to herself as she recognized the creature. "The proto-vampire?" Josh asked, recognizing the name from their shared studies during the summer. "That's what those things are?" "Yes. I don't think that they've seen us yet. We're in a lot of trouble if they do." "I don't get it. I thought that they were supposed to only show up in numbers in places where mass deaths have taken place. What are they doing here?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I think what we've seen so far from this place is only the tip of the iceberg. I think there's something even worse going on." Chapter 41. Michael was at a complete loss for words as he spotted the two teenagers coming around the corner. The mixture of shock and anger had managed to do the near impossible and strip him of any idea what to say. Sarah saw him heading their way, and her face broke out into a relieved smile. That somehow made the entire situation even more confounding. "Dad!" she exclaimed in a voice that was trying to be a whisper, but really wasn't. "I'm so fucking glad that we found you." "Speaking of fuck, what the fuck are you doing here?" Michael demanded as he found his voice. She ignored the question. "Listen, we think we know... Wait, holy shit, what happened to your finger?" He curled the fingers of his left hand into a fist to make his injury less obvious. "Later. Why are you here?" "We think we know where Jenni is." "Where?" Maggie said as she caught up. Where's Jenni? It's complicated. Sarah pointed at Josh. When we were here earlier, that woman with the weird hair. Poe, Josh supplied. Right, her, Poe. She did something to Josh and took him to this old-looking house by the rides. She made him go inside, but when he went in, he wasn't here anymore. He was in some house by the ocean. We think that they put Jenni in there. What do you mean that? Michael began before shaking his head. No, never mind. It doesn't matter. You're sure about this? Sarah and Josh exchanged a look. Not entirely, Josh admitted. I mean, I'm sure about what happened to me, but I'm not 100% sure that's where Jenni is. I'm pretty sure that we're right, though. There's a catch, Sarah said. Of course there is, Michael replied dryly. There's always a catch. Poe has the key we need to open the door to the beach house. When we opened it without it, there wasn't anything inside. Michael frowned in frustration. The more time that passed, the closer Bingo got to achieving his goal, but at the same time they couldn't just leave Jenni. He came to a quick decision. Okay, you two go with Maggie, he said. Find Poe and force her to open that door. Wait a second, Maggie objected as she realized what he was proposing. I'll be fine, he assured her. I promise that I won't do anything stupid. Well, not any stupider than usual, anyway. Just concentrate on what you're doing. Poe is strong, really strong, but silver disrupts magic. Put a few shots in her with a peacemaker if you have to. I don't like the idea of splitting up. I don't really like it either, but we don't have a choice. You need to save Jenni, and I need to at least try to stop Bingo. When you find her, get her and the kids out of here. What's going on? Sarah asked suspiciously. Why are you talking like this? I don't have time to explain. Maggie will fill you in. For a brief moment he faltered as he looked at his daughter and saw the concern in her eyes. Hey, I love you, you know. As mad as I am that you put yourself in so much danger coming here, I'm also proud as hell that you risked so much for someone else. What the fuck, Dad? You're talking like you're going off to die. He grinned. I don't have any plans to die today. For right now I need you to help Maggie find Jenni while I take care of the other issue. He took off the jacket that he was wearing and handed it to Sarah. She took it from him and examined it for a moment before her eyes opened wide. Isn't this Aleister Crowley's coat? She asked. It is, yes. It just occurred to me that you might be able to use it to open the door without needing Poe's key. Do you know how? She hesitated before nodding slowly. Yeah, I remember what you told me, but you said that I should never use this thing under any circumstances. Yeah, well, I guess this is one circumstance that I hadn't thought of. Try this first, and if it doesn't work, go after Poe. Are you sure about this? No, but I don't see a way around it. You're smart, you're resourceful, and you're a Dyer. You'll do great. Michael gave her one last smile before glancing over at Maggie. She was looking at him with concern. He knew that she didn't fully understand everything that was happening, but she knew that he was taking a big risk. There wasn't any helping it, though. While he didn't understand everything either, he did know that they couldn't afford to not find out exactly what Bingo was up to. He nodded and began walking towards the section of the carnival with the various rides. He wasn't sure if he was going in the right direction, but it was a pretty solid guess given the giant eye hovering inside of one of the roller coaster loops. Besides, he doubted that he would remain ignorant of Bingo's whereabouts for long. The creature had all but dared him to follow. Bingo wanted him to witness what was going to happen. He came to the large open area and paused. Directly ahead of him was the Ferris wheel. While the lights were still on and the music was still playing, the wheel itself was still. There were black shapes crawling across it. It was hard to tell for sure from where he was standing, but judging by the odd movements and the general body shapes, they looked like more Strigoi. It was strange that they were inhabiting the carnival. Strigoi were more scavengers than predators. While they could certainly be dangerous and attack healthy prey as evidenced by what had happened at the split log, they usually preferred to gather around places that were full of sickness and death. Then again, maybe it made sense that they would be present at the carnival. The history of Bingo Circus Extravaganza was filled with blood and death, the two things the Strigoi craved. This particular carnival must have been like a light to a moth for them. Michael kept to the outside of the open area, using the tents and buildings as cover. He doubted that he could hide from anyone actively looking for him, but he hoped that he could avoid attention for as long as possible. A movement up ahead caught his attention. A large stage had been erected behind the Ferris wheel, and he could just make out figures moving in the shadows. At first he thought it was more Strigoi, but he quickly dismissed that thought as he saw the figures were standing upright, and their movements were more methodical than the proto-vampires. As he drew closer, he could hear them talking. Being careful to remain concealed, he ducked behind one of the tents and peered out from around the side. From here he could see that there were 3 people present: Bingo, Leo, and Poe. Both Leo and Poe looked uncomfortable, while Bingo seemed enraged. "What the fuck do you mean Bango is dead?" Bingo demanded. "I found him near the bridge leading into town," Leo answered. His masked face pointed towards the ground. "He's covered in what looks like vines." "And you're sure that he's dead?" "Yes, the vines, well, they're growing out of his mouth and eye sockets. I don't know what happened, but he's definitely dead." "Michael fucking Dyer happened, that's what," Bingo growled. "If I'd known that he did that to Bango, I would have taken some flesh off of him. Go find him and drag him here. I'm going to get started on him sooner than I planned." "Absolutely, sir." Leo hurried off to do as he was told. Michael moved further behind the tent as the man in the lion mask walked past where he was hiding. He waited until he was alone again to continue watching. "I'll be able to bring him back," Poe was assuring Bingo. "Once I've taken what I need from Call, it will be easy." "That's not the point," Bingo snapped. "He took something from me. Nobody takes something from me." "We'll just have to take even more from him." She pointed up at the giant eye looking down from the roller coaster. "Call is starting to awaken." "How long do we have?" "It's impossible to say. A few hours, maybe less. Until then, her spirit will remain separated from her body." "So we only have a few hours to kill a god?" Bingo smiled his nightmarish smile. "Sounds fun." "The bait is already in place. I've got the town residents inside the section of the lodge Call's body is in. It shouldn't take long for it to make its way there and devour them." "Like a sleepwalker going to the fridge for a midnight snack. Good. You should prepare yourself for what you need to do." Poe nodded once. "I'll go to the lodge now. What are you going to do?" "It's been a long time since I've had legs," Bingo replied. "I think I'll stretch them a bit." Chapter 42. Sarah watched her father disappear behind one of the tents and out of sight. She kept an eye on him for as long as she could as her small group headed back to the Sea Lodge. There was something about the way that he had spoken to her that made her extremely nervous. Maggie had promised to fill her and Josh in on what was happening, but that conversation was going to have to wait until they had found Jenni. They reached the steps of the house. She pushed all other thoughts out of her mind. There was no point in worrying about things that she couldn't affect. She had her own issues to deal with. First and foremost was using Crowley's coat. It was lighter than she had expected, more of a spring weight jacket than a heavy coat. It was made of black leather that had cracked from years of neglect. Trying to remember everything that her father had told her about it, she slipped it on and approached the door. "You do know what you're doing, right?" Maggie asked nervously. "Your dad made it pretty clear that coat is dangerous when he told me what it is." "More or less," Sarah replied, straightening the jacket. More or less. It doesn't come with an instruction manual, but from what Dad told me, it's pretty straightforward. Maggie closed her eyes and shook her head. You sound just like him. I don't know if I can handle two of you. All right, go to it. Josh, help me keep watch. Sarah heard them moving around behind her, but she did her best to block out the noise as she concentrated on the door in front of her. She put her hand on the knob and closed her eyes. From what her father had said, the trick to using the coat was to picture exactly what she wanted to do in her head before speaking a command. It didn't matter what word was used, as long as it was something that she associated with what she wanted to happen. Open, she said as she twisted the knob and pushed inward. The door did open, but it didn't reveal the beach house. Instead, there was just the same empty room that she and Josh had found earlier. She closed it and furrowed her brow in concentration. Open was a pretty generic word. It didn't really embody what she was trying to do, either. She was trying to get the door to open into a different place. Maybe she needed to change her approach. Portal, she said as she opened the door. Once again, there was nothing. Starting to feel frustrated, she closed it again and crossed her arms over her chest. There was something that she was missing. A thought occurred to her. It was possible that she wasn't missing anything at all. Her father had said that the coat only had a very limited amount of power left in it. What she was asking might be beyond what it was capable of still doing. Something clicked. It wasn't a problem with the coat at all. It was a problem with how she was trying to use it. Josh, I need you, she said over her shoulder. What's wrong? He asked as he came up the steps to join her. The problem is that I've never seen the beach house before, she told him. I'm picturing something like what you described to me, but it's not accurate enough for the coat to do its thing. She took his hand and laced her fingers in with his. Placing her other hand on the doorknob, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. I need you to picture the room directly beyond this door, she instructed him. The room at the beach house. Try to remember every single detail of it and keep it locked in your mind. All right, he said skeptically. What is... Hush. Just trust me and do it. She gave him a few moments to get everything set in his mind's eye. She then formed an image of his face in her own mind and concentrated on it. The coat seemed to grow warmer around her body as she turned the knob. Find, she commanded. She pushed the door inward. Even before she opened her eyes, she knew that something had changed. The air that blew in her face was warmer than the cold October night in Lamplight Woods, and it was moist and had a salty smell. She opened her eyes and found herself looking through the doorway at a much different room than before. That's it, Josh said shortly. That's the house. Are you okay? She asked as she squeezed his hand. No, not really. That's the place? Maggie asked, coming up onto the porch with her gun drawn. This is where Jenni is being held? We think so, Sarah confirmed. The sheriff made a move as if she was going to go through, but she stopped herself. I'm going to go in after her. I need you guys to stay out here and keep the door open. You don't know your way around in there, Josh pointed out. I do. I should go, and you two should stay to watch the door. Josh. He shook his head firmly. It's what makes sense. Sarah needs to stay outside just in case the door closes so that she can reopen it. Nobody should be left alone out here in case those Strigoi or some of the carnival workers wander by. I've been in there before. Neither of you have. It has to be me. Without waiting for a response, he turned and stepped through the doorway. Maggie made a move to grab him, but it was too late. He looked back at them and started talking. There was no sound, however. What did you say? Sarah asked. He stared at her in confusion and pointed to his ear. Apparently he wasn't able to hear anything coming from their side of the door either. Motioning for them to move back, He stuck his head through the opening. I don't think that sound passes through the space between the two places, he said. Light seems to. I'll try to signal if I need help. He pulled his head back into the house and headed away from the door. Within seconds, he was completely obscured by the dark shadows. Sarah fought back the urge to follow him. He was right. If the door needed to be open again, she was the only one that could do it. Not knowing what else to do, she leaned up against the wooden wall and watched the darkness.